so happy to see you all here. And I'm very excited to have this Methods Monday session with Dr. Kadir Ayhan, who is a mixed method researcher and policy analyst, specializing in diplomacy, public diplomacy, and Korean foreign policy. He's currently the CEO of Diplomacy Analytics, LLC, and prior to that, he was an associate professor of international relations at Ewha Women's University, and also a lecturer in other Korean universities. So this session will be an introduction to process and outcome evaluation in intergroup communication. And in this session, Dr. Ayhan will provide an overview of process evaluation and outcome evaluation, specifically in the context of intergroup communications. So without further ado, Dr. Han, please.
Thank you for the invitation. As introduced, my name is Kadir Jun Ayhan. I'm new in DC. I was in Korea a couple of months ago, and I've established a new firm here focusing on database insights for public diplomacy, including its different variants. Today, I was asked to introduce you to evaluation methodologies. Of course, it will take a whole semester, if not more, to teach you evaluation. Therefore, today's main idea is to discuss at least some intuition that goes into evaluation work and to leave you with some words to get you started. Okay, so I'll begin with an example before I move into what I promised to do, which is to introduce you to process evaluation and outcome evaluation. Let's start with an example. And my main research area is public diplomacy with a focus on intergroup communication. So I'll start from something I know, something related to my own research. Are you familiar with the term public diplomacy? I'm not going to go into details of what it is. Okay, so why would any country do public diplomacy? What may be the expected outcome of public diplomacy? Yes?
Yeah, exactly. Kind of like public relations and soft connections between countries. And,
Yes.
yeah.
But what are we trying to achieve? Like we invest taxpayers' money in, right? Billions of dollars. In some cases, or in some countries.
To influence.
To influence, that's very good. So if we want to evaluate public diplomacy, we want to measure, we want to evaluate our influence, right? Are we influential? For example, this is a very simple model of public diplomacy. And are you familiar with DAX? Directed acyclic? No? Graphs? Okay, I'll talk a little bit more about it and maybe also introduce a software for it. This is very basic graph. So public diplomacy, you do public diplomacy, a very simple model. You affect public opinion in other countries because you engage foreign publics with the ultimate goal of influencing their foreign policies. Right? So this is a very basic model. But of course, like anything in social science, it's not that simple, right? So this is a more complicated model of public diplomacy. Yes, you want to, with your public diplomacy, can you see it all right? Okay, so with your public diplomacy programming, you want to influence public opinion and then in turn influence the foreign policies of other countries in line with your own foreign policy objectives, right? But public opinion is also affected by other things. It's not just that you organize an event in Washington, D.C. that people's ideas, let's say, for example, Korea Foundation, this morning, CSIS organized, sponsored by Korea Foundation, organized an event on Korea in Washington, D.C. So just with this event, you don't expect the public opinion in the US to turn in favor of or to support for example, South Korea's policies, because there are so many other aspects that influence both foreign policy decisions, for example, trade with Korea, trade with other countries, competing priorities. So when it comes to, for example, conflict between South Korea and Japan, which side are you supporting, right? So there are competing interests. So everything else, of course, this would be much more complicated if I didn't write other, but if I try to write everything here. So these other things influence foreign policy decisions directly and also through public opinion. And also, it's not just one-off, right? Foreign policy is something that's continuous. It's a repeated game. So what happens last year affects this year. What happens this year affects next year. So there's some policy inertia, so policy continuity, as well as moving parts that influence both public opinion as well as foreign policy. So there are so many moving parts. So public zero here refers to, for example, public opinion at time 0. This is public opinion at time 1. So you can think of it as public opinion in 1 year and the next year. So all of these influence one another. I'm not going to go into details of this, but this is what we deal with when we try to evaluate impact. We need to take into account all of this. With this just simple model, it's difficult to find the actual impact. And the red lines, again, I'll briefly go over this in later parts of the presentation, mean that there are confounders that you need to deal with. And you can deal with them just in this very basic model by adjusting for other influences. Again, if you can measure them in time 0, as well as foreign policy, whatever this refers to. So the indicator, for example, for foreign policy behavior could be, for example, UNGA voting, how a country votes in the UNGA, for example. So this is at time 0. So if you adjust for these two, this model should be more or less fine in the case that foreign policy at time 1 is the outcome that you're interested in evaluating. And public diplomacy is the exposure, or it's the main variable of interest. So how does public diplomacy affect foreign policy, right? So this is kind of the adjustment sets that we need to be adjusting for. But again, today I'll not go into details of this, but I'll focus on something that's more specific, because this is much more difficult to do. There are so many moving parts. So we'll focus on something that's more focused, which is public diplomacy events. So, but the idea here is that there are expected outcomes of public diplomacy, and we can do our best to evaluate. But we need to identify what these objectives are before starting to evaluate, right? So that part, the identification of context and the goals, is related to process evaluation. I'll come back to process evaluation a little bit later. I'll continue with an example, as I promised. So this is from the presentation of one of the very popular cultural institutes. I kind of censored it so that you don't trace this back to where I got it. Both the country and the institute. I didn't want to put them on the spot. But this is published by them, as far as I remember. I got this from a presentation, but I think they published this report. I just wanted to discuss this as an example. So in this survey, what they found is people who have been involved, so they're measuring level of trust in people from country A, okay? And then they find differences between 3 groups of people. The first group of people who have been involved in cultural relations with country with the cultural institute in question. So very much involved with the institute's events. The second group of people are those who have been involved in cultural relations with the country, but not through the cultural institute. Maybe they read a book, they watched a film or something like that. And the third group of people are those who have not been involved in cultural relations with the country in question. And they find these differences, and this was a report commissioned by the Cultural Institute. So they find that our work is valued, right? Because public funds go into our work, taxpayers' money go into our work, and in our evaluation, we find that we matter, we are important. Why? Because the more people are engaged with our cultural institute, the more they trust in our country's people. This is just one objective of public diplomacy potential or cultural relations as this institution calls. Do you see any problem with this? Or is this good evaluation? So again, actually, this is something that I'll talk about in the later parts of my presentation, but I wanted to start with this to have an intuition about evaluation.
What the discrepancy between from bottom up?
So they say that, let's say, for example, George Mason is a country. Okay, George Mason University, since we are here, it's a country, and let's say this building is an institution. So the more you attend the events of this institution, the more you trust students and people at George Mason, right? So 75% of people who attend events here trust George Mason people. But those people who have nothing to do with George Mason, let's say the other Georges, they only trust George Mason people 49%. So their trust in, or those who say I trust people from George Mason are 49%, so much less. So the institution suggests that invest in us because our work matters. Because the more people attend our events, the more they trust George Mason, for example. Any problems you see? Yes.
So I find this kind of comparison is very common in the report of the
Yes.
organization, but like we don't know who they ask the questions.
Yes.
And maybe those people who participate in the program was special group of people with special interests. They have, you know, trust already. They may have interest already. So that doesn't really show the effectiveness of.
Very good point. The exact point that I wanted to make. So if I attend programs of an embassy or of a cultural institute, it already shows that I'm interested in that country, right?
Yeah.
I wasn't selected just randomly from the street to attend their events. I self-selected. I wanted to attend their events, right? It shows that I'm interested in this country. Think about scholarships. You apply for a scholarship in a country that you want to study in, not necessarily just any country, right? How many of you are on scholarships? You're from overseas? Okay, so you chose to be here. You previously chose to be in Korea.
Yeah.
You decided, right? So it already shows some interest. It doesn't need to be perfect interest, but it shows some interest, at least compared to the people on the street, just random people. You are more interested, or you are generally more interested, right? Yes.
Yes, what I'm struggling with this model is that the party who determine the interest seems to be the one going, but not necessarily the host country, which kind of sort of takes any sort of agency
Yes.
from the host country, and it's an influence on the state policy.
Yes.
So
So let me go through this with a simulation, okay? So we'll make things clearer for you. If I don't answer your question in the next slides, ask again. Okay? So this is the website that I'm talking about. Let's recreate this together. Okay. You can start. This is degety.net. I give the website at the end again. Degety. So this is called a DAG. Directed acyclic diagrams, I think. So we have people's baseline or pre-event evaluation, right? Whether you like the country George Mason, for example, is in our example, or not, or whether you like country A or not. Your baseline evaluation. And then your participation in their events. It could be just one event, or it could be multiple events. And then what we are interested in is your post-event evaluation, right? So for example, I ask you how much you like country A, for example, right? And then you give your answers, and then I show you a clip, a film of a certain country, and then I ask you again. Again, evaluate the same country, maybe the same question, right? So pre-event is the baseline. Post-event is your evaluation after the event. It could be just watching a film, it could be a youth forum, whatever the event is. So this one is the outcome. You can select it from here. And participation is the main exposure. This uses kind of like the health jargon. That's why it's called exposure, like whether you are exposed to a virus or not. But the very same idea in social sciences. So you participate in an event, so you're exposed to something, right? So participation affects post-evaluation. So this model as it is fine. But the baseline affects your participation because you self-select yourself. For example, as I said, I attended an event organized by CSIS on Korea this morning because I'm interested in Korea. If it was an event on any other country, I would probably not attend, right? Because I was interested in Korea and the topics to be discussed. So this baseline also affects your post-event evaluation because you are still you, right? So you have something in your mind about country A, in my case, Korea. So this is problematic. So this software or this website tells you what the problem is. So that there are biasing paths that are open, back paths or backdoor paths. So you need to adjust for the baseline. So you need to adjust this baseline so that the reds are gone. When you adjust for the baseline, we are sharing, right? The people on Zoom.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, they can see. So how do we adjust for the baseline? Okay. Yes, potentially, but
Normally you would edit as a variable in the model so that
you can do that definitely. So you can use it in a multivariate model so that you can adjust for it. You can control for it, in other words. Yes. But another way to do it is maybe randomize people, right? Rather than letting self-selected people attend. For example, I randomly select some of you to attend the event without asking you how you evaluate that country before you begin. So everything is random, but of course you also make sure that randomization went all right? So there are important variables that you need to take into account, for example, demographics and like political orientation and so on. So anyways, I'll come to this again. So this is basically what I have just done for you. So we will simulate some data. And this is very important. I'll come back to this point. It's very important because when we evaluate something, we make assumptions. So in order to be sure about our assumptions, it's always good practice to simulate the data. Because when you simulate something, you know how it will behave. Because you did this. You created this. So in our simulation, this is what we will do. Same thing. So people are attending an event at a foreign country's cultural center or embassy, let's say in DC, and we are interested in public opinion about that country, right? We want to evaluate whether this event contributes to more positive evaluation of that country. This is what we are interested in. Okay? And let's say we have 1,000 people attending the events, and the baseline evaluation, 1 out of 5, let's say Likert scale. The mean is 3, standard deviation is 1. Okay, so people are on the border of liking or not liking the country. And for now, we are simulating that the event is useless. It doesn't change people's opinion positively or negatively on average. For some people, it changes it positively. For some people, it changes negatively. But on average, for 1,000 people, it doesn't change. People go enter an event, which is more like the scenario for one event, right? People enter an event, get out of it, same opinions about their country. Public opinion did not change. Okay? So for that, our post-event evaluation is baseline plus mean equals 0, which means it will not change, with a standard deviation of 0.6, so that otherwise, if I just say it's the same as baseline, it's difficult to measure because it's the same thing. I mean, we could still do that, but it's meaningless. This adds some spice. Okay. And just to make sure that we got it right, we look at the correlation between the baseline and the post-event evaluation. It's 83%, so 0.83, which is very high, right? So it's highly correlated. I think I have it in the next slide. Yes, I also visualized it. So it's almost perfect correlation, right? So people attend the event and exit with the very same view, centering at still 3. So now we know this. We simulated this data. We know this, right? I mean, I did this. You trust me? I didn't show you what goes on in the background, right? Right? You didn't see the raw data, but it is from this visualization and from, and I didn't write 80. Okay. So this also is calculation. I didn't write this. It's calculated through R. So if you trust this, you know that there shouldn't be any change. There should be no difference between baseline and post-evaluation. You know this, right? So let's check. Oh, we will now add participation, but we will build something into this participation. We will build self-selection bias. Okay? So as I said, people are more likely, generally more likely, to attend events of countries or of institutions that they are interested in already, right? Generally, it's not always the case, but this is more likely. So again, we are simulating that 2% of people with baseline evaluation of less than 3 will participate. They are less likely to attend. These are random numbers. We can change. I just wanted to make the effect dramatic. Right? So people with exact evaluation of 3, 30% of them will attend, and people who give a positive evaluation of more than 3, 80% of them will attend the event. Okay? So now you know that people who are attending the event are biased, positively biased towards the institution or the country. And now the relationship with a question mark, because we know there should be no relationship, right? It should equal to each other. But we see those who participated have a more positive evaluation of, or more positive opinion of the host country or the host country of the institution compared to those who did not attend. But we know it to be wrong because we simulated the data. So what goes in here, the main reason of this is because of the bias that we just created in the last slide. Because if you look at, if you change instead of post-event evaluation, if you change it with baseline evaluation, you see the same trend, right? Because people self-selected themselves. So this is actually not, this is true, not the previous one. But because of the previous one, we see this effect. So it's correlation. So this is a typical example of correlation is not causation. You always hear about it, right? So this is a typical example. So again, I briefly mentioned what could be a potential solution to this problem: randomization. But then again, there are problems or there are difficulties with randomization. If I am the director of a cultural institute in Washington, D.C., and I'm putting so much of my efforts and my team's efforts and money into a program, I don't want to exclude people from attending. I want everyone to be able to attend it. Or think about, for example, international development programs, right? you organize something very important in a developing country, and then you exclude some people from it just for the sake of randomization. Sometimes there are ethical problems with this. Sometimes just from the practitioner's perspective, you don't want to do it because you want it to reach all the people possible, right? But again, people like me who like to evaluate want to see randomization because we want to see impact, right? So if possible, maybe for a pilot program or for one program, you can do this, right? Randomization, if you're interested in evaluating impact. But the bigger problem is that evaluation is usually an afterthought. You do an event, and after that you want to evaluate. So how do you randomize? People have already attended. So it's an afterthought, so there's nothing you can do. Personally, I've written many articles on global career scholarship, which I'm proud alumni of. But again, I did this as a researcher and as an afterthought because I was not commissioned to evaluate their work before people came. I did that too, but you need to do these kind of studies longitudinally so that you can see the effect. But anyways, more often than not, it's an afterthought, so it's difficult to randomize people. And if possible, randomization, if done well, closes all the backdoor paths. So people's political ideas, age, gender, sexual identity, their prior experiences with other countries, political views, number of siblings, income, nothing matters. If you have done randomization properly, you close all the backdoors. You can compare two different groups, control group and treatment. Totally fine. So if this time we simulate a random participation variable, so instead of remember our biased participation, this time we randomize people just without taking into account their baseline evaluations, right? So we see the true relation, no relation, same result, right? We know this to be true compared to the other one because we simulated the data. So that's why it's important to simulate the data so that you can check your assumptions, right? You can check your models, more important. Like, I wrote this model, but I'm not so sure about it. Then simulate it. See if it will behave the way you expect it to behave. Solution two, adjusting for baseline evaluation. So you can do multivariate regression. In other words, control for that variable. Or you can try finding a comparable group, which is not easy because you need to find similarly biased group. Maybe those people who registered but could not attend. But then how do you make sure that they're not attending is also biased? So is that also random, right? People who registered but canceled or could not attend. So do you think it's a random thing, maybe because of weather or something, then it could be a comparable group. So it's for example, for scholarships, people who have applied probably have similar bias in comparison to people who got the scholarship. So it's a good comparison group. But then again, why were they not selected? So those who were selected, ideally, if it's a merit-based scholarship, may have something different than those who could not get the scholarship. So it might introduce a new bias. So we need to take into account these kind of assumptions, right? You need to be aware of these potential problems. So adjusting for evaluation, so one way is to add it into the regression. Another way is maybe you take the differences between baseline evaluations and the post-event evaluations. So now we have started with this example, set the scene for our evaluation and intuition, right? Now I'll start with a process evaluation. Did I answer your question now?
Yeah.
Okay. So with here at George Mason, one of the most famous or elite universities on conflict resolution, right? So in the aftermath of elections, we might see this as kind of reflective of the polarization in the country, red versus blue. Actually, I've been using this image for a very long time. To me, it didn't have anything to do with American elections, but today I think it might have this context. When I talk about this, my context is usually just the very idea of tribal psychology. People, the idea with social identity theory. People, even if it's a very minimal group that don't make any sense, may be inclined to favor their group in the expense of another group, or they may want to disadvantage another group in favor of their own group. Right? Relative advantage more than just absolute advantage. We want to be better than others, even if we are worse off than before. We just want to be better than them. So this tribal psychology is a problem that public diplomacy programs or positive contact-based intergroup communication programs try to address. So this could be a problem, right? That you want to address. Let's say you see that people from North Korea and South Korea hate each other. They have prejudices against each other. And you don't want that. Or people from Armenia and Azerbaijan. And you can think of many other examples. Or people, right-wing people and left-wing people have difficulty speaking to each other. They have prejudices against each other and so on. So this is a problem that we want to address. So we begin with the context. We begin with a process evaluation. We try to frame the problem and then come up with kind of if-then statements. So how do we solve this problem? If we do this, then this would happen. Taking into account this. So we set it in writing. For example, these are just some examples. For example, lack of positive contact between, let's say, people from South Korea and North Korea causes this kind of prejudices or stereotypes. And you can think of any other problem that comes to mind. And then what kind of interventions would help solve this problem? So it could be, for example, workshops to openly address stereotypes and prejudices. People sit down and talk together, or there may be collaborative projects to achieve common goals. You may be familiar with Edward Said. He, in the past, created, I think it was called East-West Orchestra, bringing together people from Palestine and Israel, so that they do something together, a collaborative project, working towards a common goal, in the spare time getting to know each other. So addressing their problems in a more subtle way than just openly, directly talking about the problems. You can search it on YouTube. There was a short documentary about it as well. An expected outcome. So what do we expect? Right? You want to, so your expectation is to solve the problem. But what does solving the problem look like for you? So what would need to happen for you to think that I've addressed this problem, or we have addressed this problem? So usually in these kind of studies, some of the expected outcomes are people participating in the program. I usually give the examples of people from different countries because I'm a professor of international relations, or I used to be at least. But in social psychology, it could be just any different groups. It could be people who like certain band over another band. It could be, again, different sports clubs, for example, or it could be political parties. It doesn't need to be international. But my examples are usually from people from different countries. So you want them, you expect them to trust each other more. You expect them to have more empathy for each other. You want them to have more positive attitudes towards each other, more humanization of the other group. And you expect them to cooperate more with each other, at least intend to cooperate more with the other group. So these are some of the expected outcomes. So it works in line with logical framework. You might have heard about logical framework. So you have some inputs that you put into activities. These activities create some outputs, and usually evaluation stops at outputs. Because outputs are usually easier to measure. For example, in our case, inputs could be things like resources for the event logistics, participants availability. So what would be the best time to bring people together, for example? It's summer. Why? Because the students are on break, so they might have more time. Or if you think that students will be looking for internships, then you would need to find a better spot, like very specific time frame for them. So you need to take into account these kind of inputs, participants' language abilities. So if you bring these people together, which language are they going to speak in? For example, South Koreans and North Koreans. Oh, they would speak Korean, right? It doesn't need to be English. But what if we bring Japanese too? Well, then there might be some language barriers. If we do it in English, we may not get the people that we are really interested in bringing together, for example, right? So you need to take into account these kind of inputs. Activities. So again, I just recreated in a way the example from Edward Said. Creating an orchestra with people from two different countries or two different groups. Or it could be any other activity. This is just an example. And outputs is, again, this is easier to evaluate. And this is usually where most evaluations start. For example, Facebook posts. I don't know if Facebook is still a thing among students. Usually Instagram it is, or I don't know, maybe TikTok. So usually people are interested in how many likes, how many retweets, how many reshares are done. Full stop. So it could be, again, how many collaborator performances have been done, how many people participate. You do an event at George Mason University, for example, how many people attended our program? It's an output that is worthy of measuring, right? How many people have watched our video? It's an output. Number of days spent together, number of posts with hashtag, for example, peace orchestra or something. But what we are really interested in is measuring outcomes. So if our expected outcomes were about increasing empathy, trust, we need to be measuring that, right? Increased trust, increased empathy, more positive attitudes, more tendency to collaborate. But of course, it's not easy. Again, do you randomize, for example, people for participation? If not, do you have a comparable group? Or do you have any other ways of adjusting for the baseline evaluations? Because one of the difficulties with this kind of programs is you are often preaching to the choir. People who don't need these kind of programs to love one another attend these programs. Like you really want to reach those kind of like people with extremist ideas or hate one another to come together and at least, even if they don't love each other, at least not hate each other to the level of extremism, right? But it's difficult to reach out to them. So this is one of the difficulties of these kind of programs. But you really want to evaluate, at least even with these people, do you get any results? Right? So this is the main outcomes or more measurable outcomes that you're interested in. But sometimes you're actually interested in something broader than this. You're not just interested in 30 people that you brought together to have, better views of each other. You want, for example, if this is Palestine, Israel, you want Palestinian and Israeli people to trust each other more, to have empathy for each other. If you brought South Koreans and North Koreans, you want it to be at a wider scale. That's why, for example, you have programs like, for example, Erasmus, student exchange programs at a very wide scale so that this kind of exposure happens at a massive scale. Or, again, more conservatively, you expect these participants to have some sort of ripple effect. They multiply their effect, at least in their immediate family members and their surroundings. So if, for example, they have more trust towards previously adversarial nation, and if their ideas have changed, you want them to be promoting this kind of worldview in their surroundings, in their circles. So this is kind of a very commonly used framework for evaluation. And this is how you would write down your assumptions for the program that you're interested in. So it usually begins from the bottom. So you have certain activities in mind. These are the tasks that need to be carried out to deliver the planned results. For example, training the participants from 2 countries together. So what are your indicators? So these are a summary of resources and means, the inputs that go into this, for example. What are the sources of verification? It could be a summary of costs and budget. So this is usually very easy to do. Assumptions, factors that are outside of the program do not affect your results. So you need to make sure of this, right? And then you have results. You have it for specific objective, and then you have it for overall goal. For each, you need to come up with indicators, sources of verification. So how are you going to measure it? Like interviews, surveys, right? How are you going to evaluate it? And then what are the assumptions? Making sure that you control these assumptions as much as you can. You can only control it if you're aware of it. For example, if you don't consider self-selection bias, then you come up with the page that I've shown you in your report. You don't address it. So for the time's sake, I'll skip this, but I'll share the slides so you can, I mean, I already shared. You can get the, so this is what I've shown you earlier. So this is an idea of outcome evaluation with control group versus treatment group. Very similar to how they would do in, for example, testing certain medicine or vaccine. So another outcome evaluation that I want to introduce is especially used a lot in policy analysis as difference in differences. So you, for example, you did a policy intervention and you see huge change. So it was going like this, and then suddenly you see a huge change. So it kind of shows you that your intervention has been successful somewhat, right? So it could be any policy. You need to think about what kind of change this policy might have done. But be careful. You are not seeing something right now. You'll see it in the next slide. Is this the only intervention? Like this is your policy intervention, but did something else happen around the same time? For example, COVID-19, right? You did an intervention, but in the same year, maybe COVID-19 happened, something huge, or maybe a financial crisis happened, or maybe the president has changed. Something else happened that year or around the same time, which might be the real reason why we see this change, not your intervention, right? So we need to take this into account. And again, this is simulated data, not real. Again, because it's simulated, I can speak more freely, right? Because I know how it behaves. And same data, I just broke it into 3 instead of 2. Why? Because we see another change here. It was like this actually. There is another important change. Let's say the president has changed. The previous president was radicalizing the people against, for example, another country. If we continue with the same example, or if he was or she was isolating the country from the rest of the world, so people had negative attitudes towards foreigners, xenophobia, and so on. But the new president is let's say, opens up the country, brings in foreigners, or sends people abroad for studies and so on. So people's attitudes towards foreigners change. Xenophobia decreases, for example, right? Or it could be any other intervention. Maybe someone else did an intervention before you. Maybe this is your policy intervention at the government level, but maybe a huge NGO or group of NGOs did something else that mattered, or a media corporation did something very important. Maybe a TV show began that addressed xenophobia, right? Something that was very popular that changed people's views, right? So you need to think about what might have caused this. So you need to break this down not only into two, as I did here, same data, same simulated data. But here, for example, it's 3. I know there has been only 2 interventions because I did the interventions. But in real world, it doesn't work like that, right? You need to think about what might have mattered. In other words, what might be some of the alternative explanations that matters for the outcome. So here we see a huge change towards the positive, but we need to address the potential causes. And then if we want to understand, if we want to evaluate the contribution of this specific intervention to the outcome, we cannot come up with counterfactuals because we cannot undo this. This has happened. But we can only try to predict what the outcome would be like without our latest intervention, in this case, 2014. If this didn't happen, what would it look like? Maybe it would look like this. So this difference is probably your real impact, your contribution, your policy's contribution. So this is what we are interested in measuring, the so-called average treatment effect, rather than just focusing on the change from here to here, and we are responsible, this intervention is responsible for it all. So we need to take into account all of these alternative explanations to meaningfully evaluate the impact of the policy intervention or an event that we did to address the problem. So final thoughts, and in summary, randomized control trials are the gold standard. If you can do it, it's the best, but it's not always possible or feasible, especially when it's an afterthought. If it's not possible, you adjust for the baseline. So, for example, in our example, it was self-selection bias. So you try to address the self-selection bias by either including it in the model or you take the differences and so on. And if it's not possible, if randomization is not possible and there's no baseline evaluation data, try finding a comparable group as similar to the group that attended your event or that benefited from a policy that you implemented, whatever it is, you try to find a comparable group. Process evaluation. Process evaluation is done at the goal setting stage. Trying to understand the context. So what is our goal? What is the problem? What kind of intervention do we need to address this problem? And what are our expected goals? So we do this at the goal setting stage. Or sometimes evaluators come in and try to help project managers kind of run through what they've maybe after the event. Maybe they didn't run through this, at least in writing. It's in their mind. So maybe some evaluator can help them write it down so that it's clear. Maybe sometimes even at a later stage, but ideally it's done at the goal setting stage. And we always need to think about the assumptions that we make when we make connections, because we are making causal connections. So when we make causal connections, what are the assumptions that we are making? So for this to happen, for these to have a relationship, causal relationship, what kind of assumptions do we make, right? So could it be the outcome of something else? So we need to consider these kind of things. And simulating the data is, I cannot emphasize this enough. This is very important. Simulating the data so that you can test your assumptions, you can test your models. And you must take into account potential confounders or alternative explanations. And here are some further reading. I just wrote 3+1. The Statistical Rethinking is a great book. It's a Bayesian perspective, not a frequentist one. The effect is a frequentist approach, but that's more modern, I would say, by an econometrician, but it's more modern econometrics approach, I think. I was trained as an economist. So most economists, for example, would not use DEC as much, but this book uses DECs. So that's why I say it's modern. Impact evaluation in practice is a workbook, kind of like guideline, kind of handbook for impact evaluation or outcome evaluation. And DEGET is the website that I've shown you, and they have very good examples of different DECs and very important tutorials and readings on how to use DECs, creating these kind of causal graphs and trying to make sense of your model if you need to adjust for something. So with that, I'll end here and get any questions you might have.